Sleeping with Dragons. More than a full lifetime ago, I recall spending hours watching flying dragons. Fire engine red and orange with stings in their tails, they hauled bodies above their own weight and incarcerated them in mud prisons. Their captives never showed any dissent, they were passive throughout. When I broke open their mud-brick prisons, invariably adjacent was a dragon's egg. The fat caterpillars slept deeply and unstirringly throughout the long incubation of the egg and made no protest at being progressively eaten alive by the hatchling. I've often wondered whether this is an isolated natural phenomenon or, with suitable variation, is quite widely practiced. The Romans had a way of saying it. They stated that those whom the gods wished to destroy they first make mad. Consensual suicide is the practice of both lemmings and humans, via harikari, alike. Men faced with a sure moral condemnation for cowardice are more comfortable, alternately, with a highly probable though less certain death. Consider the trenches of 1917. The bravest of men are simply more afraid of something else. According to Sun Tzu, the real art of warfare is in destroying the enemy's will to resist before the onset of perceptible hostilities. The dragons did this wonderfully well with their caterpillars. Even being cannibalized by their enemy brought forth no protest. The art of warfare is here wonderfully perfected. So the real art of warfare has pretty much nothing to do with shooting, stabbing, or bombing the enemy. The highest form of ascendancy consists in achieving a stupefied oblivion in the party to be suborned. This is an art form indeed, and has not been without practitioners in recent centuries. Indeed, it is hardly within the bounds of comprehension that any form of ascendancy over the human organism might be had without the likes of the dragon's anesthesia. The caterpillar would not succumb lest its brain was inoperable, wasted, and inert. In all depictions of dragons' lairs, such as those given in Tolkien's The Hobbit, the dragon lurks deep in his den, surrounded by all that he treasures. Dragons are much more intelligent than human beings, of course, so they have little difficulty in imposing disinformation upon us. They encouraged the idea that they covet and value gold beyond all else. They delight in the foolishness of this belief, and they started this nonsense in antiquity. If one withdrew all the world's copper, then communications would be paralyzed. If one absconded with all the iron, then industry and buildings everywhere would collapse. But if the entire world's gold were removed, no discernible function would be interrupted. The value of gold is so high that if it were all vaporized and teleported to the moon, nobody, other than by direct observation, would notice it. Dragons do not lay their eggs in gold. That inert and useless element is of no interest to discerning dragons. The real treasure of the world resides in obligation. I've never heard that, say many. What obligation? The obligation to serve has ever been the basis and bedrock of slavery. Nobody has ever said that obligation rules, so how can this be true? That generations of the stupid have never said something is a condemnation to think, not a condemnation of thought, surely. If you're obliged to serve me, even if I be a dragon, then who is your master? This next part is very hard for human intelligences. They can rarely see that the mirage is often more powerful in perception than the landscape, and that abstractions most readily overpower the real in human comprehension. Is the control of the human organism and the direction of its policy wholly in the power of the caterpillar factor? Controlling what is real is just too difficult for practical purposes. It will never do as a means of controlling the world. It simply won't work. Bamboozling the human race is quite readily done, but it always involves summoning abstractions into play. The poor dears are almost immediately confounded when conceptualization is employed. There are those who could help, of course, but usually vain egotisms and assertions can be relied upon to greatly assist in the rejection of them and the sowing of a triumphant confusion of each in each other. So what are these abstractions, which you assert are the dragon's treasures, which subvert and subdue the human race? The first and most important thing to be said is, of course, that these things cannot and do not exist in the natural world. Fantasy is the most readily manipulated control mechanism in the arsenal of any elite, such as dragons. The real is limited, while the abstract is infinite in its reach across the human psyche. In the end, all the dragon's prowess, potency, and prerogatives settle into a contrivance of obligation and are encompassed in one short word: debt. The debt of one man for the use of his substance by another is an honourable obligation to be met, but the debt of society for a costlessly created societal money from which there is no alternative, no other means of enabling transactions, which imparts nothing but an abstract claim upon society created in a banking and financial system, is another. The first thing about societal debt to be observed is that it is absolutely impossible in any real sense. Who can drive a water wheel with next year's flood, or bake bread with next year's wheat crop? While the ability to do so is impossible, the obligation implied by it is mandatory, enforceable, and absolute. Societal debt is possible only in the mind of man. Its victims are all volunteers. Those who apply for a loan can hardly protest at it being granted. Few can see that a system which mandates debt on pain of abstention from life is unnecessary, and fewer still see the alternative system offering. The dragon does not lie in his cave surrounded by gold. Warren Buffett has calculated that all the gold mined since the world began would form a cube only 20 meters by 20 meters by 20 meters. It would fit onto any house block. The dragon has more sense than to bother with such as this. The indebtedness of the world is approximately $250 trillion. Now, this is a hoard beyond all others, and it does indeed configure the human future. It is into this nest that the dragon lays his eggs.